What's up, fellow bike nerds? Welcome back to the Weekly Rewind, where we catch you up on all the hottest cycling news stories from the previous week. We've got a little bit of everything for you today, from prototype bikes to new patents. But my personal favorite is this: Chris Canfield's latest creation that he's dubbed the Vampire Fastarossa. This chameleon of a bike is capable of running anywhere from 150 to 220 millimeters of rear-wheel travel. But despite that wide range of travel adjustment, it might not be quite as versatile as you think. But more on that in just a little bit. The most impressive thing about the Fastarossa has to be the suspension design, which Chris is calling CF3. The 3 here denotes the 3 different main pivot locations that you can choose between, giving the bike 3 distinct kinematics, axle paths, and travel numbers. To my knowledge, the only other bike floating around these days that has 3 different suspension setups that you can choose between is the prototype Trek Session, and I highly doubt they'd ever release a production bike with that type of adjustability. In addition to the 3 locations for the main pivot, you can also run it in a variety of shock stroke lengths. So, for example, if you ran it with a 67.5mm stroke in the low setting, you'd end up with 150mm of travel. Or with a 75mm stroke paired with the high pivot setup, you could go all the way up to 220 mils. As if that wasn't enough customization, there's also a flip chip located in the lower shock mount, allowing you to run a 29 or 27.5 inch rear wheel with minimal impact on suspension kinematics or geometry. Other details on the Fastarossa include a neatly integrated chainstay guard, custom branded idler pulley, as well as a bat-shaped rocker link for maximal Vampire vibes. It's also UDH compatible, has mounts for a tool and water bottle in the front triangle, and gets fully external cable routing, other than that for an internally routed dropper post. Speaking of dropper posts though, that's where this awesome bike takes a bit of a turn downward, at least in my opinion. It's pretty clear here that Chris, who's long been a suspension specialist, has definitely prioritized suspension performance over dropper post insertion. There's a kink pretty high up on the seat tube, leaving very little room for a long travel post. So, is it truly a quiver killer? Well, if you're like me and you've gotten used to 200+ mm dropper posts, then probably not. And like I mentioned earlier, Chris Canfield has been designing suspension for a very, very long time. It's actually what you'd find on his personal name bikes, Canfield, as well as Revel bikes. And so I'm not totally surprised that he's foregone dropper post insertion for such a unique and clever suspension design like the CF3 found here. The frame only, no shock included, lists for $2,998 and is available in 4 sizes, small through extra large. Let's stick with unique boutique bikes for just a bit longer, because last week we saw the release of not 1, but 2 Gearbox-equipped short travel hardtails, the Geronimo Maletta and the Viral Derive CR. Geronimo describes the Maletta as a downcountry hardtail and has relatively long reach numbers, a low bottom bracket, and when paired with a 120mm fork, gets a 65-degree head tube angle. The raw titanium frame also gets a plethora of mounting points, but don't worry, the seat tube mounts don't interfere with dropper post insertion. Lastly, it does have rack mounts for those of you looking to use it for bike packing. The Viral Derive is surprisingly similar. To be honest, I'd have trouble telling them apart at the trailhead. This time around, the frame is made of steel. It comes equipped with either 120mm of travel up front or a suspension-adjusted rigid carbon fork. In terms of geometry, it gets a slightly steeper 66.5-degree head tube angle and a very steep 77-degree seat tube angle, as well as longer reaches across all sizes. Lastly, the Derive also gets its fair share of mounting points, and even more should you go with the rigid fork. But of course, the biggest talking point here has to be the drivetrain. Both of these bikes are equipped with a Pinion C112 12-speed gearbox. The system offers a massive 600% gear range, which, to give some perspective, is nearly 80% more than a modern 12-speed cassette. Another benefit is the consistent bump in gearing when shifting. It's exactly 17.5% between every gear. It's also, of course, much more weather and damage resistant than a typical derailleur setup. There are, of course, some downsides. That titanium Maletta frame weighs in at 11.8 pounds or 5.3 kilograms, which is about 3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms more than the combined weight of a traditional titanium frame and 12-speed drivetrain. So far this year, we've seen a lot of professional downhill teams and their manufacturers experimenting with gearboxes. And like we've said in previous episodes of the Weekly Rewind, they seem to be a pretty good fit for that discipline of riding. I can't help but wonder if off-road bikepacking might be the next direction that gearboxes take off in. Bikes like these 2 hardtails are obviously still a good ways away from the trail bikes you and I likely ride on a day-to-day basis, but it does seem like gearboxes are getting closer and closer to replacing or at least holding an even spot at the table with conventional drivetrains. And speaking of that, a little bit later on in this video, I'm going to show you a patent for an all-new gearbox made by a brand that you probably wouldn't suspect. Another rad new bike that we saw come out last week was the Cannondale SuperX. Cannondale has revived this legendary name for their latest cyclocross and gravel race bike, designed to deliver maximum speed without compromising comfort or handling. Cannondale has done this by pretty much giving a nip tuck to the current existing off-road version of the Super 6 Evo. It's got a slimmer, more sculpted tube set, which is most notable at the front of the bike where the fork seamlessly bends into the narrow head tube. It also gets increased tire clearance, now up to 48mm in the rear and 51mm up front, and integrated flex zones incorporated in the seat tube, top tube, and rear triangle. The seat tube in particular is shockingly narrow as it comes down and meets the down tube, which not only helps with compliance, but also tucks that rear wheel in just a bit more for a shorter wheelbase and a bit more aerodynamic gains. Another thing they added to this year's bike is the Delta steer tube, a first for an off-road bike from Cannondale. This allows all cables and hoses to run through the head tube, even with its slim aerodynamic profile. All these changes add up to a bike that's not just more aerodynamic, specifically 1.6 watts faster at 35 kph, but also lighter. The Lab 71 frame comes in at under 900 grams for a fully painted 56cm frame. You can get the Super X in one of 3 complete bikes, with prices ranging from the $4,200 Super X3 to the tricked out Lab 71, which lists for 15 grand. Lab 71 frame sets are also available, and you can find all of these at jensenusa.com, and we've got an affiliate link for that in the description. Our final product highlight for this week is the freshly updated Ibis Oso. In case you're unfamiliar, the Oso is the sole e-bike in Ibis's lineup, and comes stocked with 150mm of travel in the rear paired with a 170mm fork, though the bike is capable of running an upstroke shock for a whopping 170mm at the back and a 190mm dual crown fork up front. Instead of doing a ground-up rebuild, Ibis has decided to instead make some subtle but welcome changes to the existing platform. It gets Bosch's newest Performance Line CX motor and 750 watt-hour battery, as well as making the switch from Bosch's Kiox bar-mounted head unit to a much cleaner wireless remote and flush-mounted display on the top tube. The carbon layup has been changed as well, resulting in increased lateral stiffness. But in my opinion, the biggest update here actually doesn't even have anything to do with the bike. It's the price, which has gone down. The Oso is available in just one build and lists for $5,999. For that, you get a full carbon frame, SRAM GXT type drivetrain, and Fox Performance Elite suspension, as well as a lifetime warranty. This makes it one of the best bargains in the industry right now. If you want to check it out for yourself, we've got an affiliate link down in the description. Speaking of bargains, it's time now for the 99 Spokes Deal of the Week, where I've gone ahead and handpicked my favorite bike from the 99spokes.com deals page. This time around, it's the Scott Voltage YZ 0.1, which is currently over 50% off at bikesonline.com, making it just $800. Now, I'll admit that the $1,700 list price was a bit exorbitant, but again, at over half off, right now, it's a pretty dang killer deal. For those $800, you're going to get an aluminum frame, 100mm X Fusion slant fork, and a Tektro HD M275 brake in the rear, putting the total weight at an impressive 28.2 pounds or 12.8 kilograms. I've always believed that playing around on a dirt jumper, whether it's at your local skate park, dirt jumps, or pump track, is one of the best and easiest ways to progress as a rider. And now you can unlock these performance gains for less than the price of a new fork for your trail bike. As usual, you can find an affiliate link in the description. Time now for some industry gossip. And once again, we are starting this section off by taking a look at a couple new prototype downhill bikes that were spotted in the wild last week. Up first is the latest version of the Specialized Demo, which has some sort of drivetrain contraption at the bottom bracket. I'll do my best to describe these photos for those of you who are listening in via podcast, but if you're interested in prototype bikes, then it might not be a bad idea to just give this one a Google. The single chain that can be seen in the blurry spy shot runs over a chainring that's forward and slightly above the crank spindle, with no visible connection between the cranks and this drive gear, though there does seem to be some sort of small idler gear tensioning the chain that appears to rotate with the cranks. What's not seen is what's inside the mysterious black casing that's tucked in behind that chainring. The folks at Pink Bike are speculating that it's probably another chain or jack shaft transferring power from the cranks to the larger chainring, similar to Pivot's latest dual chain Phoenix. Others have speculated that there may actually be a gearbox housed in this space and that the cassette and rear derailleur seen in the photo are simply to throw us off the scent. Whatever it is that's hiding in there, it's exciting to see even more attention going towards the specialized demo, especially seeing as it's been about 5 years since that bike saw its last major refresh. The second prototype downhill bike that we saw last week was the new Scott Gambler. And the biggest story here, at least as far as can be seen in the photo, is that the next-gen Gambler will join the rest of Scott's full suspension bikes by hiding the rear shock in the frame. The frame appears to be pretty similar to the current gen Ransom, with the shock located low in the frame and a 6-bar suspension design out back. There's also an interchangeable dropout system that looks pretty polished, so we're guessing that this adjustment, most likely optimized for wheel size changes, will be on the production bike. No word yet on when the Scott Ransom will be released to the public, but we are fully expecting to see their factory riders riding it this summer. Keeping things in the prototype realm for just a bit longer, our next news story is a new patent that's been filed by Fox. And no, it's not a new fork or a proprietary shock, it's actually another gearbox. The patent shows a relatively slim-looking system, much smaller than what's currently on the market, that houses an undisclosed number of gears. The most interesting thing about this patent, though, is how Fox plans to manage shifting under load. Gearboxes work kind of like automotive transmissions, and they can't shift between gears very well while there's torque on those gears. Cars and motorcycles mitigate this by using a clutch, but for obvious reasons, we have not adopted that in cycling. Fox's patent suggests that they've found a way around this by placing what they call shift rings between each pawl. It's a bit hard to tell how this works, but the wording in the patent seems to imply that the shift rings will allow for one gear to be driven at a time while the others remain disengaged. As far as I know, there are no prototypes of this floating around, but I wouldn't be surprised that Fox has something in the works. As soon as one of those sees the light of day, you better believe we're going to be covering it right here on the Weekly Rewind, so you might as well just subscribe now if you haven't already. Moving on now from bike parts to business, and it appears that the quote-unquote mountain bike capital of the world is going to be getting just a bit bigger this summer. Ari has announced that they're going to be opening their first satellite location in Bentonville, Arkansas. The Bentonville scene has been growing steadily over the last few years, admittedly with quite a bit of help from the pockets of the Walton family, and we saw YT open a similar location there last year. According to the press release, Ari's new shop will offer bike demos, customer support, in-person shopping, and even a full-service shop that will service bikes from any manufacturer. Ari's been making some pretty big moves over the last year or so, including a rebrand from Fazari to Ari, releasing several new exciting models, and signing on some pretty exciting athletes, the most recent of which being last year's Red Bull Rampage third-place finisher, Tyler McCall. The new location will allow more riders to familiarize themselves with Ari's products, which is pretty crucial for a direct-to-consumer brand. If there's one part of the bike purchasing decision process that doesn't get nearly the amount of attention it deserves, it's the warranty. But even still, we've seen several brands start to up the ante in this category over the last couple years, further differentiating between more premium brands and those with more of a budget focus. The latest two brands we saw do this were Pivot and Deviate. Last week, Pivot announced that all their bikes sold after January 1st, 2025 will receive a lifetime warranty for material and workmanship defects and complimentary bearing replacement for the original owner, though the latter of which covers only the bearings themselves, not the labor. Deviate, who already offered a similar lifetime frame warranty for the original buyer, are also adding a bearing replacement policy. Unlike Pivot, however, they're covering the labor as well, which can be performed at any authorized dealer. To me, this commitment to longer warranties, as well as special things like bearing replacement, says two things. Number one, we're getting better at building bikes. And number two, people are wanting to keep their bikes for longer. I think both of those things are really healthy for the bike industry, especially right now as we're in a bit of a bleak point. So kudos to Pivot, Deviate, and all the other brands who are putting increased attention towards their warranty process. Now, I say that, fully understanding the irony that our last news story is about a couple recalls that we saw released last week. So clearly we're getting closer to making perfect bikes, but we're definitely not there yet. The first of these was for the Super 73 Miami SE and Z Adventure. A few of these bikes have had the retaining pin in the disc brake caliper loosen and dislodge from the assembly, which sounds frankly terrifying on what's essentially a miniature motorcycle. Owners of these bikes have been instructed to stop riding them immediately and to reach out for Super 73. They'll send you the replacement part as well as $50 to have it repaired by your local mechanic. The second recall relates to the BMC Caius 01, which has apparently had several cases of the fork steerer tube separating under heavy load. I feel like this is some horrible version of cycling would you rather. Would you rather have your brakes go out on your 70-pound e-bike or have your fork completely drop out from underneath you while competing in a gravel race? Both of those sound like the stuff of nightmares. Jokes aside, BMC encourages Caius 01 owners to visit their local BMC dealer for a complimentary inspection, and if a replacement is deemed necessary, the new fork will be installed free of charge. Now that I've given you a few more things to be afraid of on your next ride, let's go ahead and end this episode on a high note with what we're stoked on, where I go ahead and share something that got me stoked from the previous week that I hope will do the same for you. This time around, it's Braje Vestovic and Blur Media's 20-minute epic titled Planet Alaska, which showcases his one-of-a-kind, fast and aggressive riding in the Alaskan backcountry. If ever there was a mountain bike film to show your non-cycling friends, this would be it. Think National Geographic meets a Red Bull Rampage. Honestly, it's rad. It gave me some serious throwbacks to one of my favorite mountain bike films when I was getting into the sport 10 or so years ago, Where the Trail Ends. And if you've been in the game long enough to remember that banger of a film, then you know how big of a compliment that is. I've left a link to the video in the description, so grab your significant other, kid, or next door neighbor and throw this baby on the big screen. You'll be glad you did. Thanks as always for tuning in to the Weekly Rewind. We'll see you next week, and until then, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun.